Ryan approached the old factory, the looming structure casting long shadows in the fading light. His hands trembled slightly as he clutched his clipboard, eyes scanning the aged building. The job was all he could find after months of searching, but something about this place unsettled him. I needed this job, he thought, trying to reassure himself. It's just a night shift. Nothing to worry about. Inside, the dimly lit factory buzzed with the sound of old machinery. Ryan met Mr. Harris, the night shift supervisor, who seemed as old and weathered as the building itself. Harris handed Ryan a sheet of paper, his expression serious. "Here are the rules for the night shift. Follow them exactly, and you'll be fine," Harris said, his tone leaving no room for questions. Ryan scanned the list, puzzled by its contents. Never answer the door after midnight. Ignore any sounds from the second floor. Do not use the elevator after 2 a.m. He chuckled nervously. "Is this a joke?" Mr. Harris didn't smile. "You'll see. Just follow them." Ryan shrugged it off and began his shift, walking around the vast factory floor. The air was thick with the smell of oil and dust, and the dim lighting made the place feel eerie. The hum of machines filled the space, punctuated by the occasional creak of old metal. As midnight approached, Ryan settled into the break room. He flipped through his phone, trying to distract himself from the uneasy feeling creeping up his spine. A faint knock at the door broke his concentration. He glanced at the clock, 12:02 a.m. He froze, recalling the first rule. Never answer the door after midnight. It's probably just someone messing around, he muttered, trying to convince himself. The knocking grew louder, more insistent. His curiosity gnawed at him, but he stayed put. Suddenly, the knocking stopped, leaving an eerie silence that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. An hour later, as he worked, faint footsteps echoed from the second floor. The sound was soft at first but grew louder, as if someone was pacing above him. He remembered the second rule. Ignore any sounds from the second floor. Ryan's eyes darted to the ceiling. Someone's got to be up there, he thought. But the building was supposed to be empty, aside from him. He considered investigating but stopped himself, the warning ringing in his ears. It's probably nothing. Just old building noises, he reasoned, though his heart raced. Time dragged on until the clock struck 2 a.m. Ryan noticed the elevator at the end of the hall, its doors slightly ajar. The third rule flashed in his mind. Do not use the elevator after 2 a.m. As if on cue, the elevator dinged softly, its doors sliding open to reveal an empty cabin. The flickering lights inside beckoned him, the dim glow casting unsettling shadows. A chill ran down his spine as a cold breeze drifted out. "This is insane," he whispered, stepping closer. Suddenly, a faint voice echoed from the elevator. "Help me!" It was a woman's voice, filled with desperation. Ryan's heart pounded in his chest. He looked around, hoping to see someone else, but he was alone. "Okay, this is not normal," he muttered, edging closer to the elevator. The voice grew more urgent. Against his better judgment, he stepped inside. The doors slid shut with a final, ominous thud. The elevator lights flickered as it descended, though Ryan hadn't pressed a button. Panic set in as he gripped the handrail, the hum of the elevator growing louder. It stopped suddenly, the doors opening to reveal a dimly lit basement he hadn't known existed. The air was thick and musty, the shadows seeming to move on their own. Ryan stepped out cautiously, his footsteps echoing in the vast space. He followed the faint whisper, weaving through old machinery and forgotten crates. "Hello?" he called out, his voice trembling. Turning a corner, he froze. In the dim light stood a shadowy figure, its face obscured. The whispering grew louder as the figure stepped closer, revealing eyes that glowed faintly in the dark. "You shouldn't have come here," the figure intoned, its voice cold and menacing. Ryan stumbled back, heart racing. He turned to flee, but the basement seemed to shift around him, the walls closing in. The elevator was gone, replaced by an endless maze of machinery. The figure's footsteps echoed behind him, growing closer. Come on, come on," Ryan whispered desperately, searching for a way out. He spotted a narrow stairwell and bolted for it, climbing the steps 2 at a time. He burst onto the main floor, gasping for air, heart pounding in his chest. The factory was silent again. The elevator doors were shut, the machinery hummed softly. Mr. Harris stood near the entrance, his expression calm, as if nothing had happened. "I warned you," Harris said, his voice devoid of sympathy. "The rules exist for a reason." Ryan's eyes were wide with terror. "What the hell was that? What's down there?" Harris smiled faintly. "You survived. Most don't. Now you have a choice. Stay or leave." Without hesitation, Ryan grabbed his things and fled the factory. He didn't stop running until he was far away, the building a distant silhouette against the night sky. "I don't know what that place is," Ryan thought, breathless, "but I'm never going back. Some rules aren't meant to be broken." Ryan ran until his legs felt like lead, his lungs burning with each breath. The factory, now a distant silhouette, seemed almost like a bad dream. He finally stopped under a streetlight, leaning against the pole for support. His heart still pounded in his chest, echoing the frantic beats from his terrifying encounter. For a moment, he just stood there, trying to process what had happened. The faint glow of the streetlight did little to chase away the images seared into his mind, the shadowy figure, the flickering elevator, and that voice whispering from the darkness. He shook his head, trying to clear the fog of fear that clouded his thoughts. Maybe it was a hallucination, he told himself, though he didn't believe it. The cold, tangible dread he felt in that basement was too real to dismiss. As he gathered his composure, he heard the faint hum of a car engine. A taxi rolled up, the driver eyeing him curiously through the window. Ryan waved it down, desperate to get away from this place. He climbed into the back seat, slumping against the worn upholstery. "Where to?" the driver asked, his voice thick with an accent. Ryan gave him his address, not caring about anything but the escape. The taxi pulled away, and Ryan glanced back, half expecting to see the factory looming behind him. But the street was empty, save for the receding shadows of buildings. At home, Ryan locked the door behind him, leaning against it as he exhaled deeply. His apartment, usually comforting, now felt strange, as if the factory's darkness had followed him. He turned on every light, basking in the warm glow, but the shadows still seemed to flicker at the edges of his vision. He sat on the couch, his mind racing. Could he really have imagined it all? It seemed impossible, but then again, so did the events of the night. He thought of Mr. Harris's cryptic words, "Most don't survive." Survive what? He wondered aloud. What kind of place had he stumbled into? He grabbed his phone, considering calling someone, anyone, but what could he say? That he'd been chased by a ghost in a basement that didn't exist? The thought of returning to the factory made his stomach churn, but he couldn't just leave it alone. There were too many unanswered questions. Ryan opened his laptop, determined to find some information about the factory. He typed in the name, hoping for a hint of what he had encountered. The search results were sparse, mostly old articles about the factory's heyday decades ago. It had been a bustling manufacturing hub before falling into disrepair. One article caught his eye, a report about a series of mysterious disappearances among the night shift workers. Ryan's heart skipped a beat as he read further. The article, dated 20 years ago, described how several workers had vanished without a trace. The factory had been closed briefly, only to reopen under new management. There were whispers among the locals about strange occurrences, but nothing concrete. His breath hitched as he found another article, this one about the factory's reopening. The accompanying photo showed a group of workers, including a younger Mr. Harris, standing at the entrance. The headline read, "Factory reopens despite local superstitions." Ryan leaned back in his chair, the weight of the discovery pressing down on him. The disappearances, the eerie rules, the strange events, it all connected, but how? And more importantly, why was Mr. Harris still there, seemingly unchanged by the decades? Sleep eluded Ryan that night. Every creak of his apartment made him jump. Every shadow seemed to stretch and twist unnaturally. The figures from the factory haunted his dreams when he finally drifted off, pulling him into a restless sleep filled with dark corridors and glowing eyes. The next morning, he awoke groggy and disoriented. The events of the night before felt like a distant nightmare, but the lingering fear was all too real. He decided to visit the local library, hoping to uncover more about the factory's past. The library was quiet, the smell of old books filling the air. Ryan combed through archives, finding snippets about the factory's history. The deeper he dug, the more sinister the picture became. There were rumors of experiments, whispers of a cover-up, and vague mentions of the entity. One dusty file caught his attention, a collection of handwritten notes from a former worker. The entries were disjointed, filled with frantic scribbles about the shadows and the voices. The final entry made Ryan's blood run cold. They come at night. Don't break the rules or you'll be next. There's no escape. Ryan closed the file, his hands trembling. He needed answers, but he wasn't sure if he was ready to face whatever lurked in that factory. The shadows that had followed him home felt closer than ever, their presence pressing against the edges of his reality. Determined to uncover the truth, Ryan made a decision. He would return to the factory, but this time, he wouldn't go alone. He reached out to an old friend, Mark, who had always been fascinated by the paranormal. Mark listened intently as Ryan recounted his harrowing experience. His eyes lit up with a mix of curiosity and concern. "You're saying there's an entire floor you didn't know about?" "An A figure?" Mark asked, leaning in. "Yeah, and I'm not imagining it. I found these old reports about people disappearing, and it all points back to the factory," Ryan replied, his voice shaky but resolute. Mark nodded, his mind already racing with possibilities. "We'll go tonight. But this time, we'll be prepared." As night fell, the two friends stood at the factory's entrance, armed with flashlights and recording equipment. The building loomed over them, its presence more menacing in the moonlight. Ryan's heart pounded as they stepped inside, the familiar hum of the machines greeting them like a sinister lullaby. The factory seemed to breathe around them, the air thick with anticipation. Ryan glanced at the elevator, its doors closed, but he knew it wouldn't stay that way for long. "Let's get to the bottom of this," Mark whispered, his grip tightening on the flashlight. Together, they ventured into the heart of the factory, unaware of the horrors that awaited them in the shadows. Ryan and Mark moved cautiously through the dimly lit factory, their flashlights casting long, flickering shadows against the walls. The silence was deafening, broken only by the distant hum of machinery and the occasional creak of the old building. Every sound made Ryan jump, his nerves stretched taut from the previous night's ordeal. "Where exactly did you see the figure?" Mark asked, his voice low. "In the basement. It was like it was waiting for me," Ryan whispered, glancing nervously at the elevator. Mark nodded, his curiosity piqued. "We'll start there, but let's take the stairs." "I don't trust that elevator." They found the stairwell tucked away in a corner, its door heavy with rust. The metal groaned as Mark pushed it open, revealing a narrow staircase that spiraled down into darkness. The air grew colder with each step, the smell of damp concrete and decay filling their noses. As they descended, Ryan couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The darkness seemed to close in around them, the dim glow of their flashlights barely piercing the gloom. His heart thudded in his chest, each beat echoing in his ears. At the bottom of the stairs, they found themselves in the basement. It was just as Ryan remembered. Vast, filled with ancient machinery and crates covered in dust and cobwebs. But now, with Mark by his side, the space felt less like a tomb and more like a puzzle waiting to be solved. Mark swept his flashlight around the room, his eyes narrowing as he took in their surroundings. "There's something off about this place. It feels heavy." "Yeah," Ryan agreed, his voice barely above a whisper. "That's exactly how I felt last night." They moved deeper into the basement, the air growing colder with each step. The faint sound of whispering reached their ears, sending chills down their spines. Ryan froze, recognizing the voice from the night before. "Do you hear that?" he asked, his breath hitching. Mark nodded, his expression grim. "Yeah. We're not alone down here." The whispering grew louder, more distinct. It seemed to come from all around them, filling the space with an eerie chorus of voices. Ryan's flashlight flickered, the beam wavering as if the light itself was afraid. They followed the sound to a darkened corner of the basement. There, standing in the shadows, was the figure. Its eyes glowed faintly in the dark, and its presence exuded an overwhelming sense of dread. Mark took a step forward, his voice steady but cautious. "Who are you? What do you want?" The figure didn't respond. Instead, it raised a hand, pointing toward a set of old wooden doors at the far end of the basement. The doors were massive, reinforced with heavy iron bands, and covered in strange symbols that seemed to pulse faintly in the dim light. Ryan's pulse quickened as he stared at the doors. "What's behind there?" The figure remained silent, its form flickering like a shadow in a storm. The whispering ceased, leaving a heavy silence that pressed down on them like a weight. Mark glanced at Ryan, his expression a mix of fear and determination. "There's only one way to find out," Mark said, moving toward the doors. Ryan hesitated, the memory of the previous night's terror still fresh in his mind. But he knew they had come too far to turn back now. Summoning his courage, he followed Mark, the two of them standing before the ominous doors. Mark reached out, his hand hovering over the ancient iron handle. The air around them seemed to thrum with energy, the symbols on the door glowing brighter as if reacting to their presence. "Ready?" Mark asked, glancing at Ryan. Ryan swallowed hard, nodding. "Let's do it." Mark pulled the door open with a creak that echoed through the basement. Beyond the threshold lay a long corridor, its walls lined with more of the strange symbols. The air was thick with an almost palpable tension, the faint scent of something metallic lingering in the air. They stepped inside, their footsteps muffled by the thick layer of dust on the floor. The corridor seemed to stretch on forever, the end obscured by darkness. As they moved forward, the symbols on the walls pulsed rhythmically, as if guiding them deeper into the heart of the factory. Suddenly, the whispering returned, louder and more insistent. It echoed off the walls, forming a cacophony of voices that swirled around them like a storm. Ryan felt his head spin, the noise disorienting and oppressive. Mark grabbed his arm, steadying him. "Stay with me. We're almost there." They pressed on, the corridor growing narrower with each step. The walls seemed to close in, the symbols now glowing a brilliant white. The whispering reached a fever pitch, a crescendo of voices that seemed to beckon them forward. At the end of the corridor, they found another door, smaller but no less foreboding. Mark hesitated for a moment before pushing it open, revealing a small room bathed in a soft, ethereal light. In the center of the room stood a pedestal, upon which rested an ancient-looking book, its cover adorned with the same symbols that lined the walls. Ryan approached cautiously, his eyes fixed on the book. "What is this place?" Mark studied the room, his brow furrowed. "I don't know, but I think we're about to find out." Ryan reached out, his fingers brushing against the cover of the book. The moment he made contact, a surge of energy coursed through him, and the whispering stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was deafening, the air thick with anticipation. The book opened on its own, its pages flipping rapidly before settling on a single page. The symbols on the page glowed faintly, the light casting strange shadows across the room. Mark leaned in, his eyes scanning the text. "It's some kind of ritual, a binding spell." "A binding spell for what?" Ryan asked, his voice trembling. Before Mark could answer, the room shook violently, the walls trembling as if the factory itself was reacting to their presence. The glow from the book intensified, the light now blinding. "We need to get out of here!" Ryan shouted, panic rising in his chest. Mark grabbed the book, tucking it under his arm as they turned to flee. The corridor behind them was collapsing, the walls crumbling as the factory groaned around them. They ran, their breath ragged, the sound of destruction chasing them back to the stairwell. Bursting onto the main floor, they didn't stop until they were outside, the cool night air hitting their faces like a lifeline. Behind them, the factory stood silent once more, the chaos contained within its walls. Ryan doubled over, gasping for breath. What the hell was that? Mark held up the book, his expression grim. I don't know, but we need to find out. Whatever is in this book, it's connected to the factory and the disappearances. Ryan nodded, his fear replaced by a growing resolve. They had uncovered something ancient, something powerful, and they weren't going to stop until they uncovered the truth. Ryan and Mark stood in the shadow of the factory, their breaths visible in the cold night air. The ancient book in Mark's hands felt heavier than it should, as if it carried the weight of centuries of dark secrets. The factory loomed behind them, an ominous presence that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. We need to get somewhere safe, Ryan said, glancing nervously at the building. I don't want to be anywhere near this place right now. Mark nodded, his face pale but determined. Agreed. Let's go back to my place. We can figure out what's in this book there. The two men hurried to Mark's car, the weight of their discovery pressing down on them. As they drove away, the factory faded into the distance, but its presence lingered, a haunting reminder of what they had uncovered. At Mark's apartment, they spread the book out on the kitchen table, the dim light casting eerie shadows across the room. Mark flipped through the pages carefully, the symbols glowing faintly under his touch. This book isn't just a record, Mark murmured. It's a guide. A manual for summoning and binding something. Ryan felt a chill run down his spine. Summoning? You think someone was using this to summon that thing we saw? It's possible, Mark replied. But there's more. These symbols, they're not just for summoning. They're also for containment. Whoever wrote this book knew how to control whatever they brought into this world. Ryan leaned in, his eyes scanning the pages. So, if we figure out how to use this book, we could stop it? Maybe even send it back? That's the idea, Mark said. But we need to be careful. This kind of power, it's not something to mess with lightly. They spent hours poring over the book, deciphering the ancient language and symbols. As dawn broke, they had a plan, a risky, dangerous plan, but the only one they could come up with. They would return to the factory and use the rituals in the book to banish the entity once and for all. That evening, armed with the book and a newfound resolve, Ryan and Mark stood once more before the factory. The air was thick with tension, the building almost seeming to pulse in anticipation of their return. Are you sure about this? Ryan asked, his voice trembling slightly. Mark nodded, though his own fear was evident. We have to try. If we don't, who knows how many more people will disappear. Taking a deep breath, they stepped inside, the familiar hum of the machines greeting them. They made their way back to the basement, the air growing colder with each step. The door to the corridor stood ajar, as if inviting them in. Inside, the room with the pedestal was just as they had left it. The glow from the symbols was stronger now, the air crackling with energy. Mark opened the book, his fingers tracing the lines of the ritual they had prepared. All right, he said, his voice steady. Let's do this. Ryan held the flashlight steady as Mark began to chant, the ancient words rolling off his tongue. The symbols on the walls glowed brighter, the air growing heavy with an unseen force. The ground trembled beneath their feet, the factory groaning in protest. Suddenly, the whispering returned, louder and more insistent. The figure appeared, its eyes burning with an otherworldly light. It moved toward them, its form shifting and flickering like a shadow come to life. Keep going, Ryan shouted, his heart pounding in his chest. Mark continued the chant, his voice growing stronger despite the rising chaos. The figure recoiled, its form distorting as the power of the ritual took hold. The room shook violently, the walls cracking as the energy reached its peak. With a final, resounding word, Mark completed the ritual. The figure let out a deafening roar, its form dissolving into a swirling vortex of light and shadow. The vortex collapsed in on itself, disappearing with a blinding flash. Silence fell, the air still and heavy. The factory was quiet, the oppressive presence gone. Ryan and Mark stood in the aftermath, the book lying open on the floor between them. They exchanged a look of relief and exhaustion, the weight of their ordeal settling in. "It's over," Ryan whispered, his voice shaky. Mark nodded, a tired smile on his face. For now. In the days that followed, the factory remained closed, its secrets buried once more. Ryan and Mark knew that their actions had stopped the immediate threat, but the knowledge in the book was dangerous. They agreed to keep it hidden, safeguarding it from anyone who might seek to misuse its power. Life slowly returned to normal, though Ryan could never fully shake the memory of that night. The shadows in his apartment seemed a little darker, the whispering wind a little more sinister. But he took comfort in knowing that they had faced the darkness and won. And somewhere, in the quiet corners of the night, the factory stood silent, waiting.